Ethan's old pickup truck rumbled to a stop on the gravel driveway, the engine's last gasp a sigh of relief after the long, grueling drive from the city. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, was a welcome contrast to the smog-choked streets he had left behind. He stepped out and stretched his back, a genuine smile breaking across his face as he took in the sight of his lakeside cabin. It wasn't a mansion, just a rustic log house with a sprawling front porch, its windows reflecting the deep blue of the sky. This was his sanctuary, a place he had saved for years to buy, his private escape from the noise and pressure of his job. A much-needed weekend of nothing but fishing, reading, and listening to the quiet murmur of the trees was exactly what the doctor ordered. He unlocked the front door, the old key turning with a satisfying click, and the faint, dusty smell of a closed-up cabin enveloped him. He dropped his duffel bag in the main living area, threw open the sliding glass door leading to the porch, and took a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs. He was here. He was home. Just as he was about to head back to the truck to grab a cooler, a sleek black SUV with polished chrome rims screeched to a halt behind his pickup, kicking up a plume of dust. He squinted, a frown replacing his smile as he watched a woman with an immaculate blonde bob, a perfectly tailored pantsuit, and a face set in a permanent scowl step out. He had only seen her once at the last HOA meeting, but he recognized her instantly. Patricia, the HOA president, a woman whose every movement seemed to radiate a sense of self-importance. She marched towards him with a purpose, her expensive heels clicking sharply on the gravel. "Excuse me," she stated, her voice sharp and authoritative, not bothering with the greeting. "What do you think you're doing? You can't be here." Ethan was so taken aback he could only stare for a moment. "What? This is my cabin," he replied, pointing a thumb at the front door. "I own this property." "I'm Ethan." A flicker of a smile, cold and condescending, crossed her lips. "I know who you are, and I know you own this property. Theoretically. But you see, I reserved this cabin for the weekend. I sent an email to the entire community a month ago. We have a rule that all cabin owners must inform the board of their plans, and if they don't, the board can reserve the property for community use." Ethan just blinked at her. "Reserved my cabin. Patricia, that's not a rule. I read the bylaws before I bought this place. No one can reserve a private property. It's mine." His confusion was quickly turning to frustration. She scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "The rules are subject to change. As the HOA president, I'm allowed to make certain discretionary decisions for the good of the community. I have a very important fundraiser this weekend, and I need a private, secluded location to host it. Your cabin is the only one with this kind of lakeside view. It's prime property, and I'm going to need you to pack up and leave." Ethan's patience evaporated. "I'm not leaving. I drove for 6 hours to get here. This is my property, and you have absolutely no right to be on it, let alone demand I leave. Get off my driveway." His voice was firm, but it only seemed to fuel her rage. Her face flushed a deep red, and she took a menacing step forward. "You're not going to talk to me like that. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association. I am a pillar of this community. You are a single man who barely even uses this cabin, while I am trying to host an event for 100 people. You are being selfish and inconsiderate." She shrieked, her voice rising with every word. The absurdity of the situation was staggering. A person claiming she had a right to his private property for a fundraiser. He shook his head in disbelief. "I don't care about your fundraiser. This is my home. You are trespassing. Leave, now, or I will call the police myself." This seemed to be the final straw for her. Her eyes widened in fury, her lips twisting into a snarl. "Oh, you'll call the police? That's hilarious," she spat out, digging into the pocket of her pantsuit with a manic energy. "Do you know who I know? Do you know who my husband is? You think a few local officers are going to side with a man who is clearly trespassing on HOA property? I have your number. Ethan, I'm going to put an end to this right now." As she spoke, her hand emerged from her pocket, clutching a sleek black smartphone. Her thumb went straight to the keypad, punching in 3 familiar digits. 9-1-1 ... she said in a low, seething voice, her gaze locked on his, a smirk of pure vindication on her face. Yes, hello. I'd like to report a trespasser. Ethan stared in stunned silence as Patricia, his face burning with a mixture of disbelief and fury, concluded her dramatic, one-sided 911 call. Yes. An unauthorized person is refusing to vacate private property. We need someone here immediately. He's becoming aggressive. She insisted into the phone, her voice dripping with false concern. She then lowered the device, holding it up like a trophy. They're on their way. And when they get here, I hope you understand your little trip is officially over. Ethan could only shake his head. It was surreal. He was a homeowner on his own private property, and this woman was fabricating a crime to have him removed. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was a new level of Karen he hadn't thought possible. He decided to remain silent, knowing that any word he said could be twisted against him. Instead, he pulled out his own phone and began recording their interaction, a silent witness to her unhinged behavior. The sirens broke the serene quiet of the woods about 10 minutes later. Two patrol cars pulled up the gravel drive, and two officers, one older and seasoned, the other young and fresh-faced, stepped out. All right. Who called it in? The older officer asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Patricia, straightening her blazer, stepped forward with a confident, practiced air. I did, officer. I'm Patricia Reynolds, the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. This man, she said, gesturing to Ethan with a disdainful flick of her wrist, is trespassing on HOA reserved property. He's been belligerent and is refusing to leave. Ethan, keeping his composure, spoke up. Officer, I own this cabin. I have the deed and my paperwork in my truck. My name is Ethan Miller. The older officer, whose name tag read Officer Davis, raised an eyebrow at Patricia's claim. Ma'am, he's the registered homeowner here. How is he trespassing? Patricia's perfect facade began to crack. Well, as the HOA president, I reserved this cabin for a community function. We have rules. He didn't inform me of his stay, which allows me to reserve it for the good of the community. The younger officer, looking confused, exchanged a glance with his partner. Officer Davis sighed, a tired, knowing expression on his face. Ma'am, unless you have some kind of legal eviction notice or a court order, you can't reserve someone's private property. That's not how it works. You can have HOA rules about lawn care or trash pickup, but you can't just take over someone's home. That's a civil matter, not a police issue. Patricia, fuming, began to argue, her voice rising in pitch. This is a gross misuse of my authority. I'll have you know my husband is a very prominent lawyer in this town. I can assure you there will be a complaint filed about your lack of cooperation. Officer Davis held up a hand. Ma'am, you called 911 on a man for being on his own property. That is a misuse of emergency services. If there's a problem with the HOA bylaws, you'll have to take it up with a lawyer, not us. He turned to Ethan. Mr. Miller, you're free to stay. We recommend you get a lawyer to look into these claims, but as far as we're concerned, you've done nothing wrong. We'll be leaving now. With a final, icy glare at Ethan, Patricia stormed back to her SUV, revving the engine before peeling out of the driveway. As the police cars followed suit, a profound sense of injustice settled over Ethan. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. This wasn't just a petty dispute. Patricia's actions felt deliberate and malicious. He wasn't just going to let it go. He spent the rest of the day in a new state of mind. His planned relaxing weekend was now a mission. He retrieved his laptop from his truck and connected to the cabin's spotty Wi-Fi. The first place he went was the official HOA website, a surprisingly outdated and clunky page. He navigated to the bylaws and regulations section, determined to find the rule Patricia had mentioned. He scrolled for an hour, meticulously reading through every clause, from the acceptable colors from mailbox posts to the rules on landscaping. Nothing. There was no mention of a reservation policy. He found clauses about giving the board notice of long-term renovations, but nothing that would allow her to seize his home for a weekend. The more he read, the more he realized how little oversight there was. The bylaws were vague, filled with legalese that could be easily misinterpreted. It was a perfect playground for someone who liked to bend the rules. His search then led him to the public records section of the county website, where all the HOA's financial documents were supposed to be filed. What he found was even more suspicious. The last financial report was from 3 years ago, a red flag in itself. He cross-referenced this with a local community forum he found. The forum was filled with complaints about Patricia's unreasonable fines for minor infractions and her iron-fisted control over the board. Several posts from former residents mentioned mysterious discretionary funds and a lack of transparency in how the money was spent. He read a post from a man named Mark who claimed he was fined $1,000 for a landscaping violation, but was never told what the violation was. Mark had tried to appeal it, but the HOA board had ignored him until he finally gave up and paid. The pattern was becoming clear. Ethan decided to check the HOA's registry of property owners. He found his name, as expected, but then he noticed something odd. The cabin next to his, which had been empty for as long as he could remember, was listed under an LLC, Willow Creek Holdings, LLC. He did a quick search for the company and found that the LLC was registered in a different state, with its director listed under a familiar name, David Reynolds. He felt a sudden chill as he realized who that was: Patricia's husband. Why would Patricia's husband's company own the vacant property right next to his? This wasn't just about a weekend at his cabin. This was about something much bigger, and it seemed to involve Patricia, her husband, and a lot of money. The whole situation was no longer just a personal vendetta. It was the first clue in a much larger, more dangerous conspiracy. Ethan spent the next 2 days digging deeper, his initial frustration replaced by a cold, focused determination. The mystery of the empty cabin next door, listed under Willow Creek Holdings, LLC, was the thread he pulled on, and it began to unravel a much bigger mess. He discovered that the LLC was a shell company, a corporate ghost with no online presence. But a deep dive into state business records revealed a crucial detail. The director's name was indeed David Reynolds, Patricia's husband. The property had been bought for a suspiciously low price in a private sale just a few years ago. Ethan's suspicions grew. Why would the HOA president's husband buy the property next to a cabin that was constantly being targeted by the association? His breakthrough came when he remembered the old, dusty community bulletin board near the lake. He walked down and noticed a faded, sun-bleached notice about a community revitalization plan that had been proposed 3 years ago. The plan was vague, but mentioned a new park and recreational facilities. The cost was listed as an astronomical amount, to be funded by a special assessment, a huge, non-optional fee for all homeowners. Ethan remembered a vague email about it, but hadn't thought much of it at the time, as it had never moved forward. The plan had been mysteriously voted down, according to the Post, but the special assessment had been collected anyway. The money had simply vanished. Suddenly, a voice behind him broke the silence. "You looking for answers, too?" Ethan turned to see an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, holding a fishing rod. He introduced himself as Jim, a longtime resident of Willow Creek. "I saw you with Patricia the other day," Jim said, his voice quiet. "She's trouble. She's got a reputation for running people out." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She called the cops on me because she wanted my cabin for the weekend." Jim nodded sympathetically. "Sounds about right. But that's not the half of it. What are you trying to find out?" Ethan explained his findings about the missing funds and Patricia's husband's LLC. Jim's eyes widened. "I knew it. That woman has been finding me for everything under the sun for the past year: a crooked mailbox, weeds on my lawn. She's been bleeding me dry. But I knew she was hiding something bigger." He then shared a key piece of information. "My nephew is a data analyst. A few years ago, he helped me get into the HOA's old private email server after they locked me out. I found all sorts of things. The community revitalization plan was a complete sham. Patricia and David pushed it, but when they couldn't get a majority vote, they just went ahead and collected the money anyway, claiming it was for unexpected expenses. They made sure to keep the financial records off the public site after that. This was the smoking gun. With Jim as his unexpected ally, Ethan now had a plan. Jim still had access to his nephew's copied data, including old meeting minutes, financial statements, and private emails between Patricia and David. They spent the next day poring over the files. They found emails where Patricia gloated about securing the money for the revitalization, and her husband, David, discussed using it to buy up properties in the community. Starting with the empty lot next to Ethan's cabin, their plan was to systematically find residents until they were forced to sell their homes at a low price, which the Reynolds would then buy through their shell company. The cabins would then be renovated and resold for a huge profit, all while using the community's own funds. Ethan's cabin was next on their list. He was a non-resident who only visited on weekends, making him the perfect target to be fined and harassed until he broke and sold. The reservation for the weekend was just another piece of their scheme to get him out and put pressure on him. By the end of the day, they had a comprehensive file. They had copies of the missing financial reports, emails detailing the entire conspiracy, and a full list of all the properties the Reynolds had their eyes on. They even had a file with a list of troublemakers to be targeted with excessive fines, and Ethan's name was at the top. The evidence was undeniable. It wasn't just a petty dispute. It was a sophisticated, years-long scheme to steal from an entire community. Ethan and Jim knew they couldn't just present this to the police. They had to go straight to the source and expose Patricia in front of everyone. They had a mountain of evidence, and the perfect opportunity was the next HOA board meeting. They were ready. The final confrontation was on. The community hall, usually a venue for potlucks and bake sales, was tense. The air crackled with anticipation as the homeowners took their seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and wary resignation. At the head of the long table sat Patricia, flanked by the rest of the board members, all of whom looked as starched and unyielding as she did. When she called the meeting to order, her voice was a chillingly sweet facade. "Welcome, everyone. We have a few pressing matters to discuss, including some recent unfortunate incidents that have disturbed the peace in our community." Double quotes. Her eyes landed on Ethan, a cold smile on her face. Ethan, however, stood up calmly with Jim by his side. "Excuse me, Patricia," Ethan said, his voice cutting through her monologue. "I believe you're referring to the incident with my cabin. I'd like to address that, and a few other things, with the board and the community." Patricia's smile vanished. "That's not on the agenda, Ethan. We'll be addressing that at a later date, in private." Her tone was dismissive, an attempt to brush him aside. "No, it's not," Ethan replied, pulling a thick folder from under his arm. "But this is." He placed it on the table with a solid thud. "What you're referring to as an unfortunate incident was a direct result of your attempt to unlawfully seize my property. It turns out that's just the tip of the iceberg." A low murmur rippled through the room. Patricia's face hardened, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure fury. "This is completely out of line. Ethan, I demand you sit down and show some respect for this board." "Respect is earned, Patricia," Jim chimed in, holding up his own tablet. "Not demanded? And you, Mum, have earned nothing but contempt." Patricia stood up, her hands slamming down on the table. "I'm ending this charade right now. I am the president of this board, and I will not allow this kind of libelous slander. You two are nothing but troublemakers, and I will see to it that you are both removed from this association for good." "You can try," Ethan said, his voice a steady counterpoint to her hysteria. "But before you do, everyone in this room has a right to know where their money has gone." He gestured to Jim, who pulled up a large digital projection of the HOA's financial records. 3 years ago, a special assessment was passed for a community revitalization plan. This money, totaling over $100,000, was collected but never used. According to the minutes from the board meeting, the plan was never approved. The homeowners began to whisper to one another. Patricia scoffed, a practiced air of authority returning to her. "Those funds were reallocated to cover unexpected operational costs. As president, I have the authority to make those decisions. Discretionary funds, Jim said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He then pulled up a different document, a series of private emails. We went into the old servers and found something much more interesting. Emails between Patricia and her husband, David Reynolds, the director of a shell company called Willow Creek Holdings, LLC. A collective gasp filled the room. Jim then showed the documents where David Reynolds LLC had purchased the vacant cabin next to Ethan's property for a price far below market value. Patricia's composure completely broke. "This is a fabrication, an absolute lie," she screamed, her perfect blonde bob now askew. "He's making this up to get back at me for the 911 call. Don't you see what he's doing? He's a conspiracy theorist, a liar. He has no proof." "We have plenty of proof," Ethan said, pointing to the screen. He then displayed a list of properties that Willow Creek Holdings had purchased over the last 3 years, all from homeowners who had been hit with excessive, unexplained fines. This wasn't about revitalizing the community. This was a hostile takeover. "You and your husband have been using our own money to buy up our properties, fine residents until they leave, and then resell them for a profit. You claim my cabin was reserved because you were trying to find a way to find me until I gave up and sold it to you, too." The room was in chaos. The board members, stunned and horrified, began to question Patricia. "Is this true, Patricia?" A man with a gray mustache asked, his voice trembling with anger. "Are these real documents?" "Of course they're not. He's a liar. He's a menace," Patricia shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Ethan. "This is what happens when you let outsiders buy into our community. They destroy everything." Ethan looked out at the faces of his neighbors, the man he'd seen walking his dog, the woman who had a small garden, the family whose kids played on the lake. They were no longer angry at him. They were looking at Patricia with disbelief and betrayal. She had been taking advantage of them for years. The man with the gray mustache turned to the board. "I propose an immediate vote of no confidence. We'll also need a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances." "No, you can't," Patricia howled, her composure gone, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "I've done nothing wrong. I am the one who has been working to preserve our community's integrity." She looked from face to face, her eyes wild with desperation. "I am telling you, he's a liar. He's just trying to take over the board." But no one was listening anymore. The faces that once respected her now looked at her with disgust and rage. The board members began to huddle together, whispering. The motion was put to a vote. Patricia, defeated, watched in horror as one by one, the board members raised their hands. Her reign was over. The votes were counted. One by one, the board members confirmed their decisions, and the verdict was unanimous. Patricia was out. The look on her face was one of pure, unadulterated shock, as if the world she had so carefully constructed had just crumbled beneath her feet. The authority she had wielded like a weapon was gone. When the board's chairman, a man who had looked terrified just moments ago, delivered the final word, Patricia let out a strangled cry and stormed out of the hall, slamming the double doors behind her. A wave of relief washed over the room, followed by the quiet chatter of a community coming to grips with a betrayal that had gone on for far too long. The next hour was a whirlwind of motion. The board, now shamed into action, immediately voted to hold an emergency meeting to elect a new president and began the process of a full, independent financial audit. Jim, the man who had helped Ethan expose the truth, was nominated to lead the reform committee. He stood at the front of the room, promising full transparency and a return to the community-focused values the HOA was supposed to have. The neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before now came forward, sharing their own stories of unreasonable fines and threats. Ethan felt a sense of vindication, but more than that, he felt a powerful sense of unity. The community had been broken, but now it was beginning to heal. The legal consequences for Patricia and her husband, David, came swiftly. The independent audit uncovered a staggering amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, that had been funneled through the shell company for personal use. They were also found to be in violation of multiple housing codes and business laws. Ethan and Jim, with the support of the now reformed HOA, worked with the authorities to present all the evidence they had gathered. Patricia was charged with fraud and embezzlement, and David was charged as an accomplice. The story made it to the local news, a cautionary tale about a powerful couple who used their influence to prey on their neighbors. Their Willow Creek holdings was dissolved, and all the properties they had acquired through their scheme were seized, with the promise of restitution for the victims. A week later, Ethan was back at his cabin. The sky was a vibrant blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees. The gravel driveway felt different now. It no longer carried the memory of a screeching SUV and a hostile encounter. He sat on his front porch, a fishing rod in his hand, watching the ripples on the lake. The peace he had originally come for had returned, but it felt deeper, more meaningful. It wasn't just a physical quiet. It was a sense of justice, a feeling of having done what was right. He thought back to that first moment he had faced Patricia, how easy it would have been to just leave and find another place to relax. He could have driven away and let her get away with it, but something inside him had told him to stay and fight. It wasn't just about his cabin anymore. It was about standing up for himself and, unknowingly, for an entire community. The whole ordeal had been a stark lesson that sometimes the most peaceful moments are the ones you have to fight for. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, Ethan smiled. His weekend hadn't gone as planned, but the tranquility he felt now was worth every single moment of the fight.